All right, what's up, guys? Welcome back. So we're going to talk about some stuff today, and it's going to get a little bit technical. So bear with me. If you don't like technical, if you just want something exciting, don't watch, because we're going to talk about some things. We're going to talk about some things that went well and did not go well, and root cause, troubleshooting, blah, 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 blah. So we're going to do all that. So I have had this car running, as you know, for several days. You saw in a previous video, or maybe two of them, is I did have a ground jumper going around from engine block to the battery negative in the back, and I couldn't figure it out. I didn't really try a whole lot, but I did some grounding stuff. So I did the battery ground here before I had that big black negative going from the battery negative all the way up to here. So essentially I had a chassis ground in the back, I have a chassis ground to block in the front, and I had a 0 gauge welding wire going from the negative in the battery in the back all the way up to the front, and I was still having issues with the starter not wanting to work. So what would happen is I would take this jumper from the block to the negative on the battery with the jumper cable, and it would start just fine, no issues. But as soon as I remove that, and it's just a little skinny jumper cable, like 4 gauge or something, or 4 or 6, something small. So I would put that on, then it would run just fine, and it was kind of annoying. Yeah, so it would start, it would run when I had it running before. It had the jumper, but every time it didn't have that on there, when I pushed the starter button, it would just like click and then go, and it would like do a half a crank, and it would just sit there and not do anything. So I was trying to figure that out and moving grounds around and adding grounds, and then that's why I added this and like did the wire to the front, all kinds of stuff. And same thing, it would just go and it would just sit there, and I would click it again, it would go click and it would just sit there. So I kept thinking it was like a ground issue, and eventually what happened was I started to smell some like electrical burning, and it was weird. And it would only do it when I would hold the starter button, which didn't really happen that much. So if I would click the button and it would go like that, and then I would hold the starter button, then I would start to smell a little bit of burn, and I was really confused. So eventually I found some things, and I want to talk about that. So first thing I noticed was this. This was honestly the first thing that I found. So you can see that this connection was like burnt through there. You can see some copper exposed. So this section I knew was getting hot. This section was going back to the battery, which was really confusing. And then I tested it once. I touched my finger on this. I held it with my thumb, and I put ignition on, and then I pushed the start button, and within 1 second I had to take my thumb off, and it was just like burning hot. So I knew there was a problem there. I didn't know where it was. So that was the first thing that I found. But it was really strange because I have everything fused. Everything fused, 30 amp, 30 amp. I think this is like 20 or something. Like everything is fused, but the ground was getting hot. It wasn't like a positive or anything. It was the ground that was getting hot. So that was strange. All of the fuses were fine. And for a wire to get that hot, like within 1 or 2 seconds that I can't even touch it anymore, that is a lot of current. Like that is a huge current draw. So that was very confusing. Eventually I ended up feeling the wires coming out of the MicroSquirt here. I touched it, and I did this while I was cranking it, and like immediately this got hot. So there's 2 ground wires inside of here, and this got hot immediately. So I pulled the plug out, and the plug looked like this. So I'll insert a picture here, and this is what the plug looked like. So I knew I had some type of a problem here, and I felt like it was completely related to like how I was grounding it or how I wired it. So, and if you look at these wires here, I'll insert another picture here. I changed this now, but we have a switch 12 volt, constant, battery 12 volt, and then a fuel pump wire. So included in this was this ground wire. So how it comes normally, these wires are all separate. So there's a ground wire coming out of this. So in my mind, which I feel like would be pretty normal for most people, is when you have a ground wire coming out with two battery positive wires, that it would go somewhere towards the battery, or the ground would go to like a chassis ground. Like, I don't know, I feel like that's normal. But if you look at the MicroSquirt instructions, both of these grounds, pins 22 and 23 in the harness, they're supposed to go to engine block ground. So this black wire that actually comes out of here is supposed to go to engine block ground. So may or may not be a big deal, but in my situation it was a big deal because I had a starter issue. My starter was bad, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But this plug, or this wire, originally was going back through this line, back through the harness. So, and it was going to the battery. So what I did, once I figured out what was going on, one of the first things I did was take this ground and I put it back up front to the engine block ground, which that's what this wire is doing now. I cut it, and then I ended up using some alligator clips just to test it the old way after I verified it worked. So put this back onto engine block ground, and still didn't work. Everything was still working the same way. So then what I did was take this freaking starter off. So last time I was at Hunter's shop, he had a starter sitting there, and I guess for some reason had a feeling that the starter wasn't going to be good, or was worried about the starter, because that's kind of a silly thing that could really hold the project up. So I asked him if I could borrow a starter that he had at the shop, and he said, yep, take it. And I had it sitting in the back of my truck for a long time, and I took this one off, the one I had on the floor, and I put the one that I borrowed from Hunter on there and wired that up. And wired it up and started the car, and everything started flawlessly. So I didn't have the bypass ground on that I needed for this one. Sometimes with this one I needed the jumper cable ground bypass, and I needed my battery charger on it, sometimes on a startup mode, to get it to crank over and start. So with this one, I didn't need anything. I'll show you, watch. Before I show you, I guess I'll show you the grounds. I feel like my grounds are excessive on this car right now. I have a 0 gauge welding cable going from block to chassis. I have a 0 gauge welding cable going from the rear end of the block to the negative on the battery. And then on the battery back here, so here's the other cable that's coming from the front. And then I have another 0 gauge going from the negative on the battery to the chassis, which this is bolted down to a steel frame that's welded into the car. So I feel like that's pretty excessive for a ground, and should be more than efficient. So I was having a hard time understanding why the vehicle wasn't starting, or was acting like it was having a bad ground. So what I did then was I changed that starter, and I left everything exactly how it is. At that point I had the MicroSquirt grounded back to the engine. Right now it's not. But essentially how it is right now is exactly how it was before I had the starter on there, or when I had the other starter on there. So my thought is that when I had the other starter on, the starter solenoid would click. It would draw a heavy current back through the ground section like it was seeking a ground. And the way that I had it wired with the ground separate, it was seeking ground through the ground pins on the micro and melted those wires. But everything is fine now. So just to verify, I know this is kind of a long rambling video and I really got to clean up a lot of this stuff. So that's back to normal. Just what I was showing you here is that this ground is, I'm just using like some alligator clips, and this ground is the same ground that I had originally before. So essentially right now the car is wired exactly like it was with the other starter, but the other starter was not working and it was drawing so much of a current that it wasn't starting the vehicle, and I needed the extra ground jumper. When I didn't have the ground jumper, it was drawing extra ground current through the micro, melted the pins because I had them separate. That's kind of what I'm getting at. So everything is fine. Obviously you can see it just started and ran perfectly. It was fine. But it did melt the pins. I did have to take the thing apart and then check everything, resoldered some of the joints and like whatever. So I really don't even know what the moral of the story is. Maybe I feel like, I guess one thing that would be simplified is if people see this video and they get a situation like this, wire both of the grounds to the same spot, to the engine block, or maybe even the makers of the harness could wire both of them to the same spot anyways, because two of the pins go to this engine block ground right here, or one of the pins I should say, engine ground. So there's a pin down there, engine ground. It comes on a ring terminal. So one of the pins, pin 22 on the micro, goes to the engine block ground. Pin 23 goes out to a separate spot that is with the positive and the switched positive. So maybe those two grounds could just go right to the engine block ground if that's where they're supposed to go. But honestly, I feel like this issue wouldn't have even, I never would have seen this issue considering the vehicle runs fine just like it is right now. Like the issue wouldn't have ever been identified if I didn't have a starter problem and it was drawing extra current through the computer. But it happened. So maybe a way to prevent that would be to run both of those pins to the engine block ground and be done with it. So anyways, that's where we're at. I feel like this is a long rambling video. I'm tired and ready to go to bed. I did hook up my coolant temp sensor, so that was exciting. That's actually when I discovered this problem. So car was running fine, everything was great, and then I hooked up the coolant temp sensor and I went to start it and the thing didn't frickin' start, and then I saw smoke coming out of the computer. I was like, what the fudge? So that's what led me into almost 2 days of troubleshooting. So that's what I discovered, guys. We're in a good spot now, a better spot. I did put water in the block. I have zip ties holding the water in because I didn't have hose clamps. I bought them now, I have them. So that's exciting. We're getting there. Slowly but surely. Diff cover's on. I did put diff fluid in. I got 2 extra quarts of trans fluid just in case that guy is low. And we're gonna start to do some things. I did test the serpentine belt, but the belt actually hits this water neck. Fuck. So I might have to figure something out with that. And this is a truck tensioner that doesn't fit on the LS1 water pump, so I'm gonna try to shave these down and suck that turd in there and get it to line up. If not, I might have to buy one of these tensioners for like 30 bucks or something and get that to line up. So I wasn't really thinking about that. So yeah, a lot of little junk, guys. A lot of little junk. So we're gonna get this thing out this year. I promise we're gonna get the car out this year. If it doesn't go to the track, it's gonna go on the street. It's gonna go on the street. It's gonna go somewhere. It's gonna go on the street, track. Maybe we'll go ice racing. I live in Wisconsin. We'll figure some shit out. We're gonna drive this car. I don't care. We're gonna do it. And I just want to say, guys, like, total transparency, this issue like really bothered me for a while, and I had a pretty rough day today, and like even at work all day I'm just like, it's just killing my brain because I'm like thinking, this doesn't make sense. Like, I have excessive grounding on this, and it was acting like it was a bad ground. Like, it would click, but it wouldn't crank over unless I had the extra jumper cable back on. Jumper cable negative, going from negative on the battery up to the engine block. I would hook that thing up, then it would crank. I took it off, and it's only like a 6-gauge cable or something real small, and like, this doesn't make any sense because I have a chassis ground, engine block to chassis, and then I have rear battery ground, negative to chassis. It's bolted to something that's welded into the frame of the car, and I have a 0-gauge welding cable going from battery negative up to the engine block, which was connected to the chassis. It was like solid. And I'm not really that much of a slouch when it comes to automotive electronics and wiring, especially just like basic grounding stuff. And it was acting like a bad ground, so it was really bothering me that I was feeling like, okay, I have excessive grounding and it's not working. So I was really feeling like I was just missing something or doing something really wrong. And I'm glad I found that it was a starter, because I was like crushed today because I'm like, I don't know what is going on. And I'm going to swap the starter. Let's swap the starter. Swap the starter, remove the extra ground, put the wiring back exactly how it was, and it just fires just fine. So very much a relief and kind of reassurance that I'm not that stupid. All right, just for good measure, this is exactly how I had it wired before, but I don't have the jumper cable on the outside. So this will be the first, I believe it's the first real start without that jumper cable assist on there with the new starter. And it's wired exactly how it was before. So let's swirl it. Let's let her swirl. I'm excited now. Now we can just clean stuff up and get her going.